Hi and welcome back to Susanne Kurz Coaching, Death and Beyond Part 5. In the last video, I've told you about the book of Pim van Lommel, cardiologist who did studies on near-death experiences, and he drew the conclusion that there could be a consciousness that is independent of the brain, or a consciousness that could exist after the death of the brain. And that would mean that the brain does not produce consciousness, which is essentially what the materialistic worldview assumes currently. I've already told you that I think his arguments are very plausible and I find them very convincing, but as a little skepticist, I also thought maybe there's something when we can't measure brain activity that would account for such complex phenomena as near-death experiences. Maybe there's something happening in the brain that we just can't measure yet, but that would explain how this happens in the brain. Well, that's why I started to read a bit more about near-death experiences and why I want to stay with near-death experiences in this video and go on to other phenomena later on, which then will bring in more perspectives and give you a different kind of insight into the whole matter. But the first thing I did was to search for other books to read about near-death experiences back in 2011, 2012. And there is an association in the US, which it's IANDS, but there's also a German network. And these people come from different walks of life and from different fields, and they get together to study near-death experiences. And the German network is called Network Near-Death Experiences, Netzwerk Nahtoderfahrungen, and they have published these collected volumes from their conferences. There are more, I suppose. I just have the version of 2007, 2008, and 2009. I don't think it stops there. I just didn't follow up any longer, but I've read up on near-death experiences a little bit for this video to get kind of up to date, and I want to talk about some of the elements of a near-death experience and how science has tried to explain them and why I don't think that's very convincing. So first off, what are the elements of near-death experiences? There are various elements that are not present in every near-death experience. Many near-death experiences contain only a few of these elements, but if you put everything together from the reports we have, then you get the following elements. People often get out of body experiences and see themselves from above, their own bodies and everything that happens in the room. See it, hear it, and so on. Then there is a perception of moving fast towards a bright light, and it's often perceived as a tunnel you're moving through, a dark tunnel. And there are sometimes perceptions of some light beings that sometimes are identified with religious figures, sometimes people see relatives or friends. Sometimes they are dead, sometimes they are not. And they experience kind of a boulder they can't step over. Mostly, not always, there are exceptions, but mostly there are feelings of happiness and peace and joy, and they are very deep and very strong. There's always a disconnection from the body that is in pain, that has problems, that is sick and not feeling well. So that's completely gone. It's mostly wonderful feelings. Then sometimes there's a perception of a different world, sometimes of the universe, and something like precognition, that people can see the future, or just get insights into how the universe works and know and understand everything. And then they come back. Sometimes it's a decision, sometimes it feels forced. In any case, when they come back into the body, it's often a feeling of being compressed into something that's too small. And mostly they can't retain all this information that they had if they had this experience. But bits and pieces remain and can be preserved and conserved and then related. Obviously, scientists have tried to explain that without having to accept a consciousness that is independent of the body, of the brain. I think the earliest ideas were that that's just hallucinations. But there are people who had hallucinations and also a near-death experience and said, that's completely different. So at least it's not normal hallucinations. There are several options how to explain some elements of near-death experiences. And one of them is lack of oxygen in the brain, epilepsy, mainly in this area. There have been experiments with healthy people, and they induced a lack of oxygen in their brains. So they fell unconscious, and they could replicate a couple of elements, or almost all elements, of near-death experiences. The emotional level, the tunnel vision, the out-of-body experiences. So that's things that were possible to produce by creating a lack of oxygen in the brain. That's pretty convincing. Of course, there are several drugs that can induce near-death experiences. So it's basically about the chemistry in the brain, how that affects this sort of experience or can affect it. And there's a very interesting experiment which is has been done with cats, I think, which has brought the result that even if you can't measure any brain activity in deeper areas of the brain, there is some activity that can be measured. But if that can account for complex experiences like near-death experiences, complex perceptions like that, I don't know. But I found that interesting because that speaks to my skepticism about the measuring capacities of our instruments. And it's also known that after the heart stops, there is something like 30 seconds when the brain still keeps working, and not just, diminishing activities, but really high level activities, more than before. So there's always the problem that of the timing of the experience, because it could be that it's just in this 30 seconds and the person thinks it has happened longer because it feels longer to them. But, and now this is going to be interesting, we also have reports from people who had these out-of-body experiences and could see or hear or perceive things that did not happen in the same room, like in another room or some kilometers away. And that's hard to explain with consciousness and perception that is bound to the brain, to the physical body that is in one room. And obviously we always have the problem with that it's a narrative and it's mostly retrospective. So there can be errors that creep into that. It's hard to verify. And even if there's another person involved who can confirm that and says, yes, I was doing that at that time on that day, there still could be an error or something, wrong memory, or they have talked to the person afterwards or whatever. But there was the AWARE study, and that was a study that tried to prospectively catch those coincidental happenings when people whose heart stops get a near-death experience, because that seems to happen rather often to people whose heart stops. So they did something in the intensive care units in various rooms in several countries, in several hospitals. They had a projector under the ceiling, and a computer would run numbers on this to this projector, and this would be coincidental numbers, and nobody knew what numbers would be projected there, and you could only see that if you were hovering above it under the ceiling. So that's basically the position where somebody would be who has would typically be who has an out-of-body experience, and they were hoping that some people would be in these rooms when they had a near-death experience, have an out-of-body experience, notice these numbers, and then when they wake up could be interviewed and would tell the interviewer these numbers, and then they could check back if the computer at this time had shown these numbers, had projected these numbers, and then it would be confirmed that this had been an out-of-body experience where the person actually was outside their body. Now the problem is that something like 78% of the people in this study, in this experiment, weren't in rooms with projectors at the time, and most of them, except for 2, didn't have out-of-body experiences with visual input, which would have been needed for that. And that's simply because, number one, they had really big problems with formalities that made it impossible to interview all the people they wanted to interview, and then many of them could only be interviewed afterwards, weeks or months later, which was not the intention of the thing. So they had a relatively small number of people they could interview in the end. And the problem is that not every near-death experience comes with an out-of-body experience with this kind of visual input. So they had only 2 people who had that, and these people were not in rooms with projectors, so that couldn't be verified. But one of them could be interviewed in death and reported what happened in the room. And not just in the first 30 seconds when his brain was still working, but up to 3 minutes after their heart stopped beating. So really long time, and safely outside this window. And what they told the interviewer about what happened in the room could be verified based on the protocols from this the surgery that happened there, or whatever they did. So that was correct. It's not as strong as, if you could verify something the person had seen outside of this room, in another room or in another city, for example. But it has been verified that someone who wouldn't have had any brain activity, any measurable brain activity at the point in time when they had the experience, could actually perceive what really happened, and that could be verified. So that's quite interesting. Then I've also read about cases when people were actually dead for, not just a few minutes and then reanimated, but really dead, put into the morgue, and then woke up there after hours or even days, and then, reported of their near-death experience. That's really strange. I mean, yeah, you could say there might have been an error, but come on, over hours or days, that's a bit strange, really, to say. Well, that's pushing it, I would say. That's that's a bit strange if they didn't notice the person was still alive somehow. To summarize, number one, the problem with scientific explanations for near-death experiences is that the conditions on which the explanations are based would have to have been present in the situations when people reported near-death experiences, and that's not always the case, because not everyone is an epileptic, and not everyone has had a lack of oxygen in their brains. It's also in deep meditation, for example, that this kind of experiences happen. But more interestingly, this AWARE study brought some kind of really tangible evidence that there's a possibility that someone perceives actual happenings without the corresponding brain activity that would be needed for that. So that's quite interesting. Now, it's not really hard facts yet, and I think we'll stay in this area with this subject because by nature, if you're talking about experiences of people, it will always have a narrative element and a subjective experiential element, so to speak, because that's something you can't measure scientifically. But I think next time it will be quite interesting for you to learn about more phenomena that I was searching for, because I was specifically searching for cases when the scientific explanations don't apply, because then there must be another explanation. So that's an interesting topic, and I will cover that next time. Hope to see you then. Bye.